Hello and welcome to the At Sea Podcast. I'm your host, Justin McRobertson. Here's your co-host, producer Dan Portnoy. We are marching back through the book Sacred Strides, looking at different chapters, chapter by chapter. We're on chapter 4, digging into elements of the book that, actually just kind of following the arrows that the book provides. Because when I write and I wrote this book, I never really intend for a book to be a whole thing. I intend for a book to point to other stuff in you or in the culture around you. And so we're following those arrows and having conversations around them. So welcome. Hello, Dan.
Hello.
We just wrapped up a little conversation about Marvel stuff. So I'm a little conflicted, which I have been for about 2 years on Marvel things. I have deep hopes and occasional joys.
Yeah, sometimes I wonder if am I conflicted about it because is it not as good, or is it because it's not aimed at me?
I think,
that's really the question, because a lot of it is not aimed at me anymore, and I think that's okay. I think that's super.
I feel like it should be aimed at me.
Well, I think that's the Star Wars problem. I think that's
I've invested so much emotional energy into this culture, like that. Like I almost feel like I deserve better.
Oh, wow.
Than we all deserved better than the Eternals.
You didn't like Eternals?
Mm-mm.
Oh, all right. Well, I'm gonna leave that alone. I'm not gonna. Yeah.
Chapter 4.
Chapter 4. Here we are, entitled "Finding My Stride" or "Falling in Love with Work in Mexico."
Yep.
So I think the first thing you have to do, though, to catch us up, so we can have this conversation,
please,
in and around all the references, I think you need to tell us basically this story of you down in Mexicali with Doug, and who Doug is, and what you did, and that. So can you tell us that story?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was at the time, this is early in life for me. I think I was 19-ish, 19, 20, maybe early 20s. And I was doing Young Life work, and I was playing a little bit of music. And most of the music I was doing wasn't like on the road professional performance stuff. I was leading songs. So if you're not a religious cat and you don't go to religious services, there's oftentimes a white guy with a guitar in the front who will be playing guitar and asking you to sing along. And that was me for a long time. I still do that some. And I was decent enough at it that I got jobs doing it. I was doing it at the church that I was helping to plant, etc. And Doug was a youth pastor across town who I had mostly heard rumor of from people who really liked Doug. And this part isn't in the book, but when I met Doug initially, like I didn't grow up around youth ministry, and the whole youth pastor thing was sort of like it was a mystery to me, because folks felt very conflicted about their youth pastor past. By the time I was 19 or 20, folks had been like through youth group, and then had these like the stories, these like semi-mythological stories about like the greatness or the horridness of their youth pastor. And Doug as a person seemed to dodge both those narratives. He was just this really thoughtful, caring adult who wanted kids to be healthy and know they were loved by God. And I liked Doug as a person. So he asked me to travel with he and a group of high school kids, about 200 high school kids, to a town in Mexicali, a town in Mexico called Mexicali. It's a border town. It's about 4.5-ish hours if you drive out of San Diego to get to Mexicali. And telling the story now comes on the back end of like a whole lot of conversation about the potentially negative effects of short-term missions, that like folks will send like the white savior team to this poor brown town in Mexico, do some stuff, and then leave and go to Disneyland and feel like victors. Like, look, we solved poverty and helped brown people. And meanwhile, like what has happened, this is the disastrous side of it. Meanwhile, what has happened is that we've ingrained in our white youth the notion of, to some degree, the notion of white supremacy, that because you come from a wealthy white neighborhood, you automatically have something of value to offer people who live in impoverished non-white areas of the country. So we sort of ingrain that. And that's one of the things we've talked about a lot over the course of the last 15, 20 years. And or along with that, sort of diminished the experience that people have living in towns like Mexicali, or that, like, what it looks like to live well where you live doesn't have to look like what it looks like, doesn't have to look the same as what it looks like for me to live well where I live. And so I, by nature of showing up like the the savior, I diminish your experience of life. Now, I know that now. I didn't know that then. I didn't know, like, hey, short-term missions have a potentially disastrous effect on multiple cultures. And as I look back, um, what I know about Doug's execution over the course of years in Mexicali, again, like, counters and undoes and dodges that, because the way he went about his relationships with people within his own ministry and over the border Mexicali was so profoundly different. He would be in Mexicali 10 or 12 times a year, most of the time on his own, because he had actual friends who were pastors. He had friends in local politics. He had friends among the local police. He had friends who were just friends. He would be in Mexicali multiple times a year, visiting, in relationship, and in conversation. So that by the time he got there, the expression that he was offering wasn't like, hey, we are a wealthy white group of people from Walnut Creek, California, and therefore we automatically have something to offer you. It was, I've got some friends who live in this town, and I'm going to take some kids that I'm leading to go help my friends. And when he introduced us, um, the folks who went with him, to that place, it was about our growth and development. Like, in other words, he didn't say, like, they need us. What he said was, this is an experience that you need for your own development and you need for your own well-being. And it situated us in a position of learning and humility, as opposed to a position of power and victory. And then they didn't go to Disneyland afterwards, which is always like, for better or for worse. So that's the context. Is I didn't know that I was entering into this other person's, like, deep life work. It was just it was a job, and I took it, and I got caught up in a windstorm of redemption and all kinds of other stuff.
Okay, but the specific thing I like to talk about is like team. What did you call it? Team no sleep.
Yes, team.
Team no
What did I
sleep.
call it in the book? Um, I cannot remember what I wrote in the book, but yeah, there was like a group of people.
Team sleepless. Team
Team
sleepless.
Sleepless, that's what it
Yes.
was. There's a group of people on the way down. We drove from where I am in the Bay Area, and it's about 10 hours to the border. It's a long, long drive. And at some point, I was asked by the folks in the van I was in if I was interested in joining Team Sleepless. And there's a group of folks who've been on this trip, the mostly leaders. I think they're exclusively leaders who, during the 5 days, 4 nights we were there, they would not sleep. That they would go about their day and do the work and all the stuff. And then when it came down to the end of the night, they would sit together, debrief the day, pray, talk, and then try to get through the night, praying. So that the way I'm finding the section of the book right now, that, like, the tail end of the night would look like this. Is like, 7 a.m. organized song sheets, 7:30 sound check, 8 a.m. breakfast, 8:30 I would lead songs, 9:30 a.m. would leave to different places in the area with folks doing service projects or what have you. And then we come back about 3 p.m., return to camp. I would try not to nap. Dinner at 5 o'clock. 7 p.m. I would organize song sheets. 7:30 I would lead songs again and do the evening gathering. And then at 9 p.m., once all the students were heading back to their tents and going to sleep, this group, Team Sleepless, would get together and sit around a fire and try to make our way all the way through the night in prayer and conversation. And it was amazing.
Yeah, so part of that sounds not that fun to me. Um the, I mean, I get the, like, I've been in situations like that where you're totally spent.
Yep.
But the idea being that, like, if somebody said, "Are you signing up for this?" I'd be like, I'm not. I actually am not." And I don't know if that's just because I'm in my late 40s now, so I'm like, I don't
Yeah.
know if I'm signing up for that. And maybe I think that's a wiser move
Yeah.
than moves that I've made in at college age. But um, so, but the thing that is interesting to me is that you come out of this and you loved it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I
so
mean,
that seems odd.
well, I mean, it wasn't in my early 20s, like, it wasn't the only time I'd spent, been up all night, right?
Sure.
I've been up all night doing homework. I'd been up all
Sure.
night playing. I think I've told you the story, like, when,
Mhm.
like, the very first console, I got to buy with my own money is I got the Super Nintendo, and
Mhm.
it came, I think, with Super Mario Bros.
Oh yeah.
And I stayed up more than one night in a row so that I could finish the game. So I had been, and these are all different ways to spend myself, right? I spend
Sure.
myself doing homework. I spend myself doing video games.
Right.
In my early 20s, I know this now. You're right when you point out, like, well, I'll be 50 in a couple weeks here, in a few weeks here, but, like, yeah, that doesn't sound as appealing now. But in my early 20s, I had just crap tons of energy and availability. And the question I'm being asked by the cultures around me is, like, how do you want to spend that time and energy? I don't know that that's what's being put on me at the time, right? That's what, like, it's not, I don't know that I'm being asked a question by my university. I just know I'm supposed to do things. But the question I'm being asked is, like, do you have availability to be up all night, to spend lots and lots of time becoming the student we need you to be? And I don't know that by the media culture around me, like, the question I'm being asked is, like, can you spend your time and energy here? I don't know I'm being asked that question. But really what's happening in my early 20s, the question is, like, how am I going to spend all this time, energy, and availability I have? And I loved saying yes to this. So the way I wrote it in the book, I said, I had so much fun. I loved every minute of it. But more than just enjoying my time, I felt very, very alive, which is one of the differences between, like, staying up all night doing homework and, to some degree, even, like, staying up all night to finish, like, your first run on Halo, which was, like, the other time I did. Like, I, got the Xbox with the hard drive, had Halo 2. I was like, I'm gonna finish this game.
Heck yeah.
Um, and what I wrote here is, I said, it's possible you've heard the St. Irenaeus expression, the glory of God is a man fully alive. And that was me that week. I was entirely in my element between music and conversation and the physical labor. That week was the closest I'd felt to anything resembling St. Irenaeus' expression, and it was the work I was doing that got me there. I don't think I would have articulated it quite this way at the time, but I know now that I was deeply and regularly connected to God and those around me. So, did I have time and energy available to stay up all night doing things? Yeah, like, I'm 20, 22, whatever I was at the time. I've got tons of time and energy, and, like, I'm not going to suffer deeply, like, in the days to come, because I'm emotionally at the time made of rubber, and I'll come back.
Right.
But the experience of, like, giving myself over to that kind of work in the context of Doug's life and to prayer, I was able to touch base with, like, with this kind of, I don't want to call it energy, but this, like, I don't know, this electricity of, gosh, it feels so good to spend myself that way, to be
Mhm.
exhausted, because there is that sort of, like, drive. There's a really good feeling of, like, it can feel really good to be exhausted, but to be exhausted, doing that felt really, really good, and I felt really alive.
Yeah, and I think that it's funny as you were talking, I was thinking about, like, yeah, I don't have as much time or energy to devote, but it maybe that's really more the question of, like, what are you going to do with it versus which I had much more time in my young 20s than I do right now.
Yep.
But there are still days that I can feel exactly that same way of like, no, no, no,
Yes.
I made some good choices. You know, like this was good. You know, if I'm working on a project and we just like kill ourselves trying to get it done and we make the big steps, I'm like, okay, yes,
Yeah.
this was good. That was a good day. I'm tired, but a lot
Yeah.
of the days I get home and I'm tired, you know, so that's not really the question. It's just more like, how do I feel about how I spent my time? So that I think that's pretty interesting.
Yes.
um the one of the things that you talk about there was that you were happy being me and not in some kind of ego driven way. I liked who I must be in order to have been gifted such a special experience. And so I think that's the upside of like,
Hmm.
yeah, definitely the short term missions has, and it is really interesting because honestly, I think that 15 years ago, conversation 20 years ago of just like, oh, I didn't even realize that this could be bad, that white savior idea. And because I've
Yep.
done short-term mission stuff, whether it's, you know, just like I growing up in Boston, we would go to Philly and we would just like we would work, you know, or do something in Philly just because it was different than Boston, because we could
Yep.
just drive into Boston and it'd be like, all right, but we're gonna go to Philly and we're gonna work with a homeless shelter there, and that, and we're gonna stay at the shelter, and it's gonna be a whole thing. And that was actually really awesome. But in and it was also very awesome because the guy, well, I think everybody realized that it was a lot more about us at 14 and 15
Yeah.
changing,
Yeah.
experiencing something, and really like coming up against something, and really kind of taking a big hunk off us, if that, you know,
Yes.
to kind of smooth the edges of something. So that was such a big deal. When you start talking cross cultural, I think it does go really different really quick. And I think the sensitivity to being like, you're a person, I'm a person, I'm not here to tell you that I'm better,
Yep.
but I think that but there are helps that we can do, um,
Yeah.
that do make a difference. But I do think like, well, and I just think, you know, culture cross culturally, cultures have been smashing into each other for a long time, and it's more about hospitality and
Yep.
and than anything. I think
Yep.
more than anything else, about like, you know, showing off your cash money or a trip to Disneyland, which I did not know was a thing, because, you know, growing up in Boston, we didn't just go to Disneyland when we could,
No.
or drive by it, you know,
No, it's a kind of
on
a
the way.
California thing, I guess.
Yeah. So I mean, cool, but wow. Um, the other thing you talk about here is, just like, you give this quote, just like there's a particular depth of peace that comes with being well rested, there's a particular and unique joy that comes with being well spent. So I think that we've spent like 3 chapters here talking about rest.
Yep.
Probably that's been out front and center about
Yes.
rest. And now and now you're kind of switching gears and we're talking about work. And I think
Yeah.
it's interesting because you actually haven't used the word work at all
Hmm.
in this so far. You just said spent,
Yeah.
because we are working on stuff all like, because I don't necessarily think like I'm working like this. Just recently it was like I was the chauffeur for my kids homecoming, you know, and
Yeah.
I drove a whole bunch of kids down, and I was just the chauffeur, and it was fine, and we, you know, I was super spent at the end of that.
Yeah.
Was that work? Kinda,
Yeah.
but it was more like, it was just like being, which is kind of
Yeah. Okay.
interesting. That was just like, yeah, I'm just taking care of my biz with my kid, and I want to make sure that she's all right. And yeah, and the other kids that are running around, and then the other parent, you know, of course, the other parents were like, "Thank you," and I was getting high fives and, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
For They were like, "You stay up late, sounds great. I'm gonna go to home and go to bed." And they weren't worried about stuff. So it is interesting that I don't. I was spent at the end of the night, but I was
Yeah.
just like, "Yep, that was good. That was a really good thing to do." So how does, I guess, the well rested versus being well spent,
Yep.
they're both expressions? Is that what you would say?
They're both expressions. They're both practices. I mean, this is you know, one of the things I'm going hard after in the book is that rest is not the thing that rescues us from the drudgery of work.
Mhm.
Like that what we're chasing in rest, what we're desiring in rest is a sense of aliveness, a sense of wholeness, a sense of completion, um, and that we chase that exact same thing differently in work. That they're both So going back to the Parker Palmer quote that the both action and contemplation are rooted in the same place, which is a relentless desire to be fully alive. I experience that if I rest well. I experience being present, and folks talk about this all the time when we talk about rest culture. And this is the issue I have with a lot of self-help or self-care culture, is that it's the me-centeredness of, like, I've got to take care of myself, I've got to have a me day, I've got to get rest, I've got to get more space, I have to have more margin, and all those things are gateways to the kind of life that my soul is begging for. I want to feel more fully alive, and so I need to get more margin, I get more space, I need to have a me day, all that kind of stuff. That's not wrong, but part of what ends up happening is as we tell that story that way, we make work an enemy. That if I'm expending myself, if I'm working almost in any way, shape, or form, like, that's a thing I'm going to have to recover from by way of rest. And I think that's a shit way to think about how my life is actually structured, because my soul, my heart, my soul, my like, I want to work for the same reason I want to rest, is because I want to feel fully alive. And the more that self-help and self-care culture makes an enemy of work, like, the further down the line we go, like, ignoring a really healthy part of our souls. That part of being fully alive is looking up from pure exhaustion, being just wrecked, and looking back at the hours I spent and how did I get here, and being able to trace my steps back and say, like, I'm so glad I did that. I'm so glad I did that. I'm so glad I did that, and I'm so glad I did that. And I'm so happy I'm as tired as I am right now, because I know how I got here and it was all good. That is as much and as an expression, a desire, and a practice of whole lifeness as being fully rested. It's one of the core elements of the book, is getting after that.
Okay. And like while you were saying that, was the thing I was thinking about was like, also when you're talking about work and you're talking about feeling good at the end of it, I think it would be easy to say, well, because I'm doing work that I find fulfilling.
Yes.
And but what if you're not? Like what I don't is that um
Yeah, it's good.
is that a case where we are is that an exception? Cuz
No.
I kind of don't think so, but
No, it's a process. I mean, and part of what we learn only by doing work and paying attention to ourselves is, like, you are, not all work is going to be satisfying to every person or every person's soul, but the only way to figure that out is by doing work, getting spent, having a conversation, spending yourself, do it by doing work, and then having conversations with a coach, with a spiritual director, with a caring friend, with a community, with a mentor, and saying, I love this, I don't like this. Again, getting to that place of, like, go spend yourself. And this is part of why I tell the story in the book, is for young for my younger readers, all, like, four of them. Um, for my younger readers, almost everyone who reads my stuff is, like, right around my age. But if you are a younger reader, or if you're a podcast listener and you're in your 20s or your 30s, like, now is the time. You do have oodles and oodles of energy that, and Dan's gonna nod his head when I say this, you will not get that back. You don't get this is, I mean, this is like solar energy, for God's sake. Like, it's there, it's available, you can use it right when you get it, but there isn't a way to capture it and then save it till your 60s. That's not how it works. You've got time, energy, and availability now that you will never get back. Use that time by spending yourself as fully and completely as you possibly can in all the best ways you can imagine, so that by the time you're in your later 30s, early 40s, you've learned the lesson of, like, I can spend myself here or spend myself here. Here I can do and I'm okay. Here, when I do, I feel so fully and completely alive. The only way to learn that is by doing it. It's like getting on the court and taking 150 jump shots and figuring out, one, like, I'm just not a 3-point guy. I'm just not. I can't, I don't have, like, my elbow hurts or whatever. Like, I'm more of, like, a kind of internal perimeter guy. I'm more of a 17-foot jumper guy. Or, like, I'm an inside the paint guy. And that's what, like, literally the only way to learn yourself as an athlete is by doing the thing, figuring out what works for you and what's best for you. That's it. So the energy we have in our 20s and early 30s ought to be spent. I'm literally saying this, like, I'm very rarely this prescriptive. The energy we have in our 20s and 30s and our availability ought to be spent on experimentation, on adventure, on like overdoing it. Get as tired as you possibly can in your 20s trying everything. So that by the time like you actually have to like pin stuff to pay for life, you know what brings you life. So that's the long answer to like, yeah, some work isn't life-giving. But damn, bro, you don't want to be trying to figure out what it is you love doing when you're 56 and like you owe $3,500 a month just to keep your damn house. You don't
Mhm.
want to be there. You want to know by the time you have to make that kind of money, like what it is you do that brings you joy. So spend the time and the energy in your 20s figuring that out.
Yeah, I often go to the basketball court and learn that I am not good at it at all. So it doesn't really matter whether I am in the paint. It's more like, hey, this seems cool. I'll be here on the bench and watch. Great guys, everybody go. Um, yeah, and that's what I learned in my 20s.
Yep.
So um, I think that it is interesting how much is like, yeah, that cup just keeps filling back up automatically in
Oh
your
man.
20s, and I do love that, and I tell it to every person who I know that is graduating, like in and around my kids' age and my community here, of just like, yeah, you should just do anything that you
Anything.
like,
Yep.
just try everything. It's going to be awesome. You're going to learn, you're going to hate stuff, you're going to, but just the idea that like it's kind of it's kind of a poop show on purpose, like just,
Yes.
and there's no expectation, and that I think, and I wonder as a parent, as my kids get into their 20s, because it's starting to be like, I have to have no expectations on what's happening, because that's probably the smartest idea of like,
Yep.
yeah, just make sure you can live, but like just do everything
Yep.
and everything, uh,
Yeah,
which
it's what
is
I mean. Again, the question on the table most of the time is like, how are you going to spend yourself?
yeah,
Like what like you can, insofar, and this is not true of absolutely everybody, but it's true of way more way more people than people give themselves credit for. You probably have, let's say again, we're talking to the listeners and the readers who are in their 20s and early 30s. You really do right now have a much more significant safety net than you give yourself credit for. And something in
true,
your life is probably telling you to be afraid. Something in your life is probably telling you to play it conservative and play it safe and get it right now. And I'm going to tell you that not just because I'm turning 50, but because I sit with people in their 60s and 70s now who are wishing to God that they had spent their 20s and their 30s experimenting, playing around, figuring things out, because they are trapped now in their 60s doing work they don't love, and they're trapped because they played it conservative, they played it responsible, and just did the right thing and never learned their own joy. You don't want to live there. You don't want to end up there, because at some point it all ends, literally all of it. And what will have mattered is if you were fully alive while you were here. So
yeah,
figure that out. Figure out what it feels like. And that's why I tell this story. Is like what I figured out while I was in Mexico was like, oh, that's what it feels like. That's what it feels like to be like super spent and fully alive. And I have spent the rest of my vocational life chasing that feeling. Like I don't want I don't want anything else. It's like finding that food. It's like finding that coffee drink. It's like finding that thing. Is like that's how I'm now. I'm obsessed by that. I will chase that. I don't want another thing. That's the thing I want. And that's what I've spent my vocational life since then doing. What takes me to the place where I'm spending the best of my energies. I am exhausted and done when I'm done, and I feel fully alive when I'm doing it. And if it's not that, I'm just not going to do it
great. Now, one of the things that I think you also add in is this, is on the spiritual side, that you make this quote, but was what was offered to me by God sounded less like you'll be good with these tests, and something more like, come join me here. I want you to feel what I feel when you work with me. So the idea that there's this invitation
anymore.
that's being given, but I don't. The other thing that I think is always confounding in the 20s, because people start saying, well, what's God's will for my life,
Yeah. It's a
and
good question.
everybody just like, and then they're stuck because they're like the quicksand of navel gaze,
Yes. Yep.
because I can't figure it out
Yep.
versus my the thing that I just love was like, do you remember what the look at the book of Acts? They were like, well, we're not really sure what we're supposed to do. So let's literally cast lots, which I think is
Yep.
hilarious of just like, I'm gonna
So
draw
good, dude.
straws. I'm
So
gonna
good.
draw. Let's pray about it real quick. Let's
Yep.
pray. Then we're
Yep.
gonna draw straws. Then we're gonna do a thing. Go.
Well,
And
and
like in
this is that fundamental spiritual. This is the fundamental spiritual narrative shift. There are two primary cultural narrative shifts that I'm after in the book, and the one has to do with like nixing the contentiousness between work and rest. Like I want to kill that with a fork,
Mhm.
a spork. I want to kill it with a spork, so
That's cool.
it's messy and comical at the same time. The other one has to do with this narrative shift, the spiritual narrative shift around the notion that God really needs to get some shit done and needs your help doing it.
Yeah,
Like, stop. No,
not
no.
even.
What if there is a desire at the core of all things? If the core of all things, if God has a particular desire for your life, it is that you would be fully alive, happy, and in relationship with God. That's it. That's literally it. If I believe what I believe about God to be true, which is that God holds all things together and will finish all good works according to God's own time and power, and that God alone is capable of accomplishing the things that God has set out to do, then my responsibility is to be obedient to God and God's will. And if I pay attention to the work of God over years, what I notice is that God's heart is God's desire is the development and the fulfillment and the joy of the people that he is working with. You being fully alive. Does God need to get things done? Yeah, man, I don't know. Ask God. Does God want to get stuff done through you? Yeah, like, we don't get to say that and talk about how, like, corrupt and all that kinda stuff we are. Like, we don't get to do that. What we get to do is say, God's desire for me is that I would be fully alive and happy, joyous, the most complete version of myself as he's forming me into and in a relationship with God. And that anything God's inviting me into is an invitation to that. I'm not necessary for the restoration of the planet. I'm not necessary for the reconciliation of all things to God through Christ. Come on. What I'm necessary to is the development and the completion of God's work in me. That's the ball game. And that's literally all there is. And everything on the other side of it is God's to do.
Yeah, the thing I like to say is that it's really only two questions. It's go play outside, and so the question is like, well, are you outside? And if the answer is
Mm,
no, then you need to go outside. And
that's
then
good.
if are you playing is the other one, and if you aren't, then go play. Like just that whole idea of like
Yes.
it's actually much more simple than I think we try and figure it out. And I feel like every pastor, and I don't want to throw every pastor under the bus, but I feel like as soon as it's like discern God's will for your life, there's like 3 points in a poem, and you have it's like years, and you have to like go away, and there's like there's monks, and
Yes.
there's like you're in sackcloth and ash of some
Yeah.
sort, as opposed to just like no, just what do you like doing? Like if we
Yes.
say that God is all that we say he is, uh then aren't our desires part of that? Like, I just don't.
And aren't our desires part of what God has established in us? In other words, to trust the ongoing quiet work of God in your heart, soul, and your mind. In other words, like, what on earth makes you think? What on earth would make me think that I was aware enough of the work of God in Christ in me? I was aware enough and wise enough to know, like, this is what God has established in me. Like, what makes me think that? What makes
Mhm.
me think like I'm the best discerner of that? Part of what I get to part of I get to trust is like if God is at work, is that part of what I get to trust is that God is actually at work in me all the time, which is to say far more often than I figure, and in ways I could not imagine, and in places that I don't like, that I don't want to even go. And one of the places I don't want to go, some of this has to do with the culture we're born into, some of this has to do with just being a human, is I don't trust my own desires. But it is my will that God is shaping more so than anything else. So specifically and particularly once I get into this is why experimentation in your 20s and 30s is so important. Is because part of what we learn in that time is we go chase the things we want. And the thing we learn to trust by the time we get on the other side of our 20s and 30s is that actually my desires, but the core of my desires aren't actually corrupt. They're choices I've made and mistakes I've made or misinterpretations of the things that I want that have led me down pathways that like probably weren't great. But at the core of this, like what I want is to feel fully alive. And I want to feel fully alive. I want to feel useful and purposeful in the world. I want to do work that's meaningful. I want to feel like God is pleased with me. I want to be in a relationship with people who like me. Like these are all rooted in my desires. Learning to trust our desires quite literally only happens in relationship with God over time in the practice of work. That's it.
Right.
I don't get to that by like removing myself to the desert and not doing anything.
Well, I think
Some cats can do that. That's probably not you.
right, but and I feel like the correction part comes in from being in community, because then
Yeah.
if you've got voices next to you going, "Hey, hey, 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 you're what are you doing?" Like
Yeah.
it's off. Not people that are trying, like, because you have to be careful, because I feel like if you are going for something that's your dreams, for example, or you're
Yeah.
chasing after something that you really love, I feel like there's a whole group of people that have given up on their dreams and they try to talk you out of doing yours. So there's that
Yes.
voice,
Yep.
and that is a very sad voice, but it's a very real one.
Yes, it is.
Um, it's a very real one, but and it's usually crowded around money and stability,
Yep.
because the fear is there.
Yep.
But then secondly, is the just that strong voice that's going, okay, I think you're close, you're doing well,
Mm.
or maybe this idea that you're supposed to be the end all be all of creation, maybe that's not good, because that's not how this works.
Yep.
Like you're too self-centered
Yep.
about what you're chasing after.
Or feeling too responsible to the mission
Yes.
itself or to the externals.
Yes.
Um, which and here we go. And this again, part of what the story gets to is like it wasn't my thing; it was Doug's thing. So I was decentralized. Like it wasn't like, hey, we're going on a retreat with Justin McRoberts and it's the Justin McRoberts shows. It was like like Doug's world, Doug's relationships, Doug's mission, like Doug's context. I was decentralized. And so like being about me, Doug was making it about me. He literally invited me on the trip because he wanted me to have that kind of experience. In the same way that he invited those kids on the trip. And I love this. This is what I was trying to get to earlier. Doug knew that like the most value there was going to be for these kids and for me on the trip was who we became as we were doing it. That was the
Right.
value. He didn't put on airs that like if we can get this group of 200 white kids and Justin McRoberts to Mexicali, Mexico, we will bring about revival and most likely potentially the second coming of Christ itself. Like that was not that wasn't in his thing. What his thing was is like this is a good work. I know it's a good work cuz I'm doing it. So he was doing the work and he was attentive to the work of the Spirit in him. I'm going to invite other people into this work and what I'm going to trust is that in this context God's going to establish work in the lives and the hearts and the minds of these kids, including McRoberts, that wouldn't be done. That wouldn't get done otherwise. He made it about us. He didn't make it, and this is the other way to be selfish. He didn't make it about like my power and my ability and my execution. Like, well, we got to get him down there because he'll kill it. No, he wanted to get me down there because he knew it would change my life
In your ministry
in
also.
my ministry.
No.
Yeah.
I think that's I think the other thing that's really cool about it is that, like, as much as, so you get to experience this thing, but it wasn't about like, and now you have this heart for the people of Mexicali and you
No.
have to keep going down there. Like, that wasn't your thing, but what was in there was this through line of like, oh, I've experienced something now that when you experience it again, you're like, okay, it's kind of something to chase a little bit,
Yep.
instead of just like, oh, it's only available there in Mexicali,
Yep.
and under these circumstances. It's much more about like you're being invited in to do a thing or to stretch yourself,
Yes.
that much more. You say this good work, or action has provided me that sense of aliveness in ways that contemplation in prayer or silence or just about any form of devotion simply does not.
Yep.
So the working things out, and I think that that tension of like, yes, be rested,
Yes.
be present and rested and do that thing, but like also know, because I just feel like in general, and I do this, have this conversation with my kids all the time because they're very active with school, they're moving like crazy, they're just like super spent, and I'll be like, okay, so the Sunday there's not anything happening, or Saturday there's nothing anything happening. I think you should probably just chill out.
Yep.
And they'll be like, okay, well, what does that look like? And so then we're having that conversation of like,
Yep.
it might not be throw yourself down a media hole of just cruise on Netflix
Yeah.
all day. That's
Yeah.
probably not going to do it.
Nope.
But what are the things that are going to restore you in
Yep.
those moments? So I guess in the good work kind of thing, that your action is giving you more of a sense of aliveness. What are what are some ways that we can like do that? I mean,
Yeah.
so maybe I'm not in my 20s and 30s now,
Yep.
and I've experienced some things, but what what now?
Yeah, especially if we're deeper into life, you got to get some help, because the voices around us and the cultural pressures, institutional, the very real life pressures around us. If I'm not practiced at this, by the into my 30s, 40s, 50s, I'm gonna need a lot of help because the voices of hyper responsibility and utility, yeah, they've got their claws in you, and that's just true. And so you're gonna need help. Get help, get a spiritual director, get a coach. And what those folks will do is help you pay attention as best you can, as best they can, to the voice of God in your life so that you can distinguish between, this is such a key piece. You can distinguish between the general sense of obligation and responsibility, because and well, so I'll finish the sentence first. Between the general sense of obligation and responsibility and the voice of the divine. What we tend to do in hyper responsible cultures and in our hyper responsible lives is we tend to conflate these two things. That so long as I'm being responsible and getting my bills paid, so long as I'm contributing to the bottom line, so long as I'm tithing, so long as I'm doing all my responsible stuff, then I'm most likely squarely in the will of God. And what I miss when I believe that is I miss that the will of God is the development and the wholeness, the happiness and the joy of you. You are the thing God is chasing. You being fully alive is the thing God wants, not you contributing, being responsible, paying your mortgage. Odd as it sounds, God's concern about you paying your mortgage is entirely predicated on whether or not being able to pay your mortgage is the thing that brings you long-term joy and fulfillment as a person. That's it. So, um, get someone who can help you distinguish between those two voices. And as you learn to distinguish between those two voices, between the voice of general responsibility, and obligation versus the voice of God in your life, part of what you'll have to do by doing that is the parsing line is going to be about desire. What is it that you are not doing that you really wish you were? Like, how are you wishing you were spending your time in your life that you're not spending your time, that you're not doing yet, will become one of those questions. It is a relentless and consistent consideration with folks in their 60s, 70s. It's why we have midlife crises, is because it's because I have not been doing the things that are in my guts to actually want to do. But I don't really think I can do those, so it's going to be the Corvette or the Ferrari. I'm like, oh god,
Mm,
it's like, boy, you missed that one too. So that's how that works. Go get some help,
yeah.
and learn to parse those things, and let's start making a plan for how to go chase things that are deeper in your heart, that are like actually rooted in your soul's desires.
Great, great. Last quote that you say in this is, "Being fully alive isn't all about being well rested. Sometimes it's being well spent. More than that, belovedness isn't a static reality. It is a lived and embodied reality." Um, so we've got now we're getting kind of this tension that we're starting to talk about. So it isn't just like the pendulum swing, because I do think it was like was it was it pre-COVID? It was everything was like the rise and grind kind of thing,
Yep.
and that happened for like 2 years, and then there was
Yep.
a pendulum swift that or swing to back to rest culture and self care, and it was like self care, self care, self care. Then COVID happened, and everyone was like, I literally don't know what to do with my life because what the crud is happening.
Yep.
Um, and the whole world is shutting down, or I'm, you know, working my crud job trying to get through this whole thing, staring fear in the eyes of every human soul I'm seeing. Um, and now we're just kind of like, I don't know what to do
Yeah.
because I'm supposed to work really hard, but there's no. I think in some ways it's like COVID showed us is like there's no guarantees,
No guarantees.
and I think that in as much as that's horrifying is great,
Yep.
because if there's no guarantees, then we need to live a certain way, um, because there's no
Yep.
guarantees. Then that I
Hmm.
think is a really good thing. Um, how do we? Yeah, I guess pushing into being well spent. Um, and I think that the interesting thing would be like if you haven't done a lot of experimentation in your 20s and 30s, the time that you'd have to be well spent gets smaller,
Yes.
but it also still means experimentation,
Yes.
and that can still be very joy bringing and life giving,
Yeah.
even though you're spent. What I mean, I know, talking about coaches, talking about um, I guess it's just like I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that these are good bookends, but
Yeah.
it's just how do we make sure in terms of a community, do you have to get louder with your community and say, "Hey, this is something that I'm going to be doing and I would
Hmm.
like your input on," or I'm going to be beyond the coach piece because you
That's
still
good.
have to involve the people around you of like this is some
Yeah.
stuff I'm thinking about, as opposed to we could continue the normal mundane conversation of just like, so your smoked meats look good, nice, keep the barbecue going, um, as opposed to like, hey, I'm trying to thing, I want to do a thing, because I think when you were talking about like um the voice of God in our lives,
Yep.
and it's always the interesting part to me is usually it's the voice that's um in my own life is not, it doesn't sound exactly like me, it sounds
No.
sometimes similar, but it's
Yep.
not, it's usually still like and maybe this is just kind of a weird thing internally, but it's like it's about 85% me. It's
Yeah.
like, but there's 15% going, no, 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 no.
Yeah.
You gotta,
I
like
think
pushing me and pull, and making me uncomfortable.
I think the communal piece is key and vital, and we got to a little bit of this earlier. Is it's hard to make sure of this, but yeah, I mean, you do want to be surrounded by people. Surrounded by, you probably not. Very few of us are surrounded by good people. You want to have people in your life, some people in your life, who have done enough of their own work that they can actually be good to you, and they're not pushing their like uh not even agenda, but like their fears on you. That's 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 hard to figure out. But with folks around you who do care about you, it's a spouse, it's a sibling, it's a best friend, um, could be work partner, whatever, is start having conversations with the folks around you, which I have to have pretty regularly with my world because I've like been taking almost nothing but risks since I was 23 on my work choices. Is saying this is what I'm wanting to do, this is what I'm pursuing, this is what and to offer that as a conversation, to offer like, hey, this will affect you. I'm gonna hit the road with a ska band. I'm gonna get in a bus and I'm gonna drive to Chicago and I'm gonna start a 48 show tour with a ska band. How does that sit with you? But to have those conversations, like I'm thinking about spending $20,000 on this master's degree thing. How does that sit with you? Not asking so much permission, but to sort of test the waters of the folks around you and look for like it as a discernment tool. Because of the what oftentimes happens is the voice of hyper responsibility, which is sometimes the voice of the Antichrist, will convince you that anything you want to do. This is also very the war of art. And it will convince you that anything you want to do that actually like works towards angles itself towards the betterment of your soul, that's probably not a good idea. Like the voice of high responsibility, so like, yeah, don't do that one. And then when you and don't even ask your friends about it. This is the other thing it'll say is don't ask your friends about it because you're going to get embarrassed. You're going to look like an idiot.
Yeah, you look
And
foolish.
you're going to look foolish. What happens And I'm saying this as a coach who's pushed this on folks hard, and then they go to their friends and they go to their spouses, specifically spouses, and they go to their loved ones and they say, I want to try this experiment. And their loved one goes, oh, thank God. I have been waiting for you to take this risk because you are not happy and I really want you to be happy. If you're surrounded by people who actually love you, part of what you hear is a discernment process when you bring joyful risks to those people. And they'll say, homie, I trust you to hold shit together because you've done that. I know you can, and I know you will because you've chosen to do that for us, for your family, for the company. I want you happy. And if you need to take 5 to 10 hours a week now to go do this other thing, what do I need to do to support you in that? I'm telling you, 95% of the time, that's what we find out when we go outside and we start asking the folks around us about the risks we want to take. I miss it in my 20s. I didn't do it in my 30s. I'm 40, 50, 56, 57, 60. I need to ask the responsible people around my life, I want to try this experiment. And they're gonna want it for you because this is the shape of the human soul. It's not just you. It's literally everyone because we were designed to live in joy and in fullness and is the desire of God for humanity. So when you ask loving people around you, they have that desire too because that's the way they were designed.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, I think we should call it there.
Let's call it there.
That's a good chapter 4. So next time, chapter 5.
Chapter 5. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the At-Sea Podcast. I'm your host, Justin Roberts. This is my friend Dan, who is the producer of the At-Sea Podcast. If you would like to contribute to this work that we are doing, you can jump to patreon.com/Justin McRoberts and join this team. And if you don't want to do that, that's fine. Keep listening. We'll bring the best we can to those folks and to you. Also, most of this the conversation, almost all this conversation is predicated on stuff that's happening in the book called Sacred Strides. I want you to buy the book. If this is touching anything in your soul, I want you to buy the book because it's good for my long-term career, but mostly I do things I do because I think they're actually helpful. And I think this is a season in life in which a lot of us are asking these questions and trying to figure out how to live well. This book is a great tool for you, and it points you to other places. Heartsandmindsbooks.com, one of my dear friends, Byron Borger, that is my favorite place for people to buy this book. If you go there, order from him. If you're more of a click kind of person, it's at Amazon. I think it might be on sale again at Amazon. I'm not sure. That happens off and on. But wherever you get the book, fantastic. Thank you, and see you again. Bye.